Man, I'm thinking maybe.
We're all well aware of Netflix's bad habit of canceling good shows. They did it with Mindhunter, they did it with Midnight Club, and then there was Ratched, and with an E. I mean, the list of good shows that were wrongly shut down just keeps going. But we got lucky with shows like You and Stranger Things because at least they're getting a final season to wrap up the story in 2025 after being stretched on for years. While Demogorgons still feel like miles away, Joe Goldberg is lurking just around the corner with Season 5. Since 2018, this show and its legendary protagonist has captivated us all with its thrilling and suspenseful story arc. I think the best part was how the show had wasted no time to reveal the seemingly charming bookstore manager's spiral into a dark obsession with the women that caught his eye. Most importantly, we see the show from Joe's perspective, which allows us to actually see the world from his view. But Joe Goldberg was never just some hopeless romantic. He was shaped by pain and molded by obsession. Every woman he ever fell for wasn't just someone he loved, she became a project, a symbol of something he was desperate to fix, to control, to redeem himself through. But what happens when the cracks start to show? When the idea of love is twisted to a point that it becomes dangerous and even deadly? While many critics have labeled Joe as a psychopath, I think it's essential to delve deeper into his character from a psychological perspective to get a better understanding of his motivations and behaviors. So without wasting another moment, let's find out. Is Joe just a tragic product of a broken past and unresolved trauma? Or is he something darker and just pure evil? Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin.
You got the wrong guy.
No.
Who is Joe Goldberg? What's his story in You? Penn Badgley's Joseph Joe Goldberg is a charming and seemingly normal bookstore manager who goes on to become obsessed with all his girlfriends and often resorts to extreme measures to control their lives and eliminate anything or anyone that he views as a threat to his relationship. To wrap it up in a sentence, he's basically a lunatic serial killer and obsessive stalker who uses technology and social media to stalk the people that he thinks he loves. In the first season, Joe is seen to be a bookstore manager in New York where he meets an aspiring writer named Guinevere Beck. And before you know it, he quickly becomes obsessed with her and starts stalking her on social media in order to use the information he found to get closer to her. He soon becomes Mr. Right Guy at the right time, and using his effortless charm and intelligence, Joe manipulates situations to insert himself into Beck's life by presenting himself as the perfect boyfriend. But as their relationship deepens, Joe begins to see obstacles in his way, such as Beck's friends and her casual boyfriend, Benji Ashby. But given his white knight syndrome or savior complex, Joe starts doing everything to protect his relationship and ensure that Beck stays with him. He even took extreme measures, including kidnapping and murder, to eliminate anyone he saw as a threat. During this time, Joe also developed a protective relationship with a young boy named Paco, who lived in his building and constantly suffered from his mother's neglect and his stepfather's abuse. Joe saw Paco as a younger version of himself and tried to protect him in every way possible, thus justifying his violent actions as a way to save those he loved. But as the season progressed, Joe's obsession with Beck became more intense to a point that he indirectly began controlling every aspect of her life. It wasn't until the season finale that Beck began sensing that something was deeply wrong with the man she loved, as Joe was not who he appeared to be. Finally, when Beck discovered Joe's dirty truth and held him accountable for killing her ex-boyfriend and her best friend, the psychotic bookstore manager imprisoned her in a glass cage in the bookstore's basement. Despite her efforts to escape, Beck is ultimately killed by Joe, who stages the scene to make it look like someone else was responsible for her death, and the first season ends with Joe believing that once again he had gotten away with his crimes until, of course, Candace Stone, his ex-girlfriend whom he thought he had killed, unexpectedly reappears. setting up a cliffhanger for the next season. In the second season, we see Joe flee from New York to Los Angeles in order to escape his past and start a new life after stealing the identity of a man named Will Bettelheim. But even though Joe thought his past was no longer a liability for him, the cycle only repeats itself when he meets Love Quinn, a talented chef who works at her family's grocery store in LA. Still, this time he was determined to avoid repeating the same mistakes, and so Joe tried to maintain a healthy relationship with Love, but his old habits of stalking and obsession soon resurfaced because, old habits die hard. As Joe grows closer to Love, he also begins to develop friendships with others around him, like Ellie Alves, a teenage aspiring filmmaker, and Delilah Alves, Ellie's older brother and an investigative journalist. However, his efforts to redeem himself are once again compromised when he discovers that Candace, his ex-girlfriend whom he believed to be dead, was actually alive and hell-bent on exposing Joe's true nature to everyone. This season basically explores Joe's internal struggle as he tries to reconcile his dark nature with his desire to be a better person for Love. Throughout the episodes, Joe faces various challenges, including Candace's growing suspicion as she infiltrates Love's life to expose him and the dark secrets that Love herself has been hiding from Joe. The real shock actually comes at the end of the second season, when it was revealed that Love also had a dark side. When Candace tries to expose Joe, Love actually kills her to protect him, and then goes on to reveal how she hired a private investigator to tail Joe, which basically meant that she had been aware of Joe's violent actions all along. As it turns out, Love is just as manipulative and lethal as Joe. The look on Joe's face was a treat to watch as Love confessed that she kidnapped, killed, and lied just so they could be together. So this time we see Joe facing a new dilemma. Even though he has finally found someone who has accepted him for who he is, and they were now happy together with their son Henry, Joe realized that his obsession with Love has been replaced by a new fixation on his neighbor, which suggested that Joe could never really change as he was trapped in an endless cycle of obsession. Coming to the third season, we see that Joe and Love are now married and living happily in Madre Linda, a wealthy suburb in California, where they're trying to build a normal life to raise their son Henry. But despite their attempts to lead a quiet life, Joe's obsessive impulses haven't really disappeared, as it doesn't take him very long to develop a sickly fixation on their neighbor, Natalie Engler. While Joe struggles to control his desires, Love is also far from stable. When she discovers Joe's obsession with Natalie, in a jealous rage, Love ends up killing the neighbor, which creates a series of problems for the couple as they find themselves forced to hide the crime in order to maintain appearances in the community. Throughout the season, Joe and Love face various challenges in their relationship, including infidelities, distrust, and their own dark pasts. The situation only becomes more complicated when they meet Matthew Engler, Natalie's husband, who begins to suspect their involvement in his wife's death. Not just that, Joe and Love's relationship also deteriorates further as they become more suspicious and violent toward each other. Even though Love tries to save their questionable marriage, Joe becomes increasingly obsessed with Marion Bellamy, a librarian he develops an obsession for once again. At the end of the season, all hell breaks loose when Love discovers Joe's plans to run away with Marianne, and so she decides to kill him by poisoning him. She even tells Marianne everything about Joe's real nature and gives her enough time to run away with her daughter. However, Joe, always being one step ahead, manages to turn the situation around, killing Love and staging the scene to make it appear that she committed suicide after killing several people, including him. In fact, he chops off his toe to leave behind evidence, so as to keep the authorities from raising any further questions. Joe then abandons his son Henry at the home of a couple he deemed suitable to raise him and flees to Europe, assuming a new identity. The season ends with Joe in Paris, still searching for Marianne, making it clear that his obsessive and murderous nature is far from being overcome. Finally, in the fourth season, we see that Joe was now using the identity of Jonathan Moore to try and start a new life in London after being determined to leave his past of murders and stalking behind. He gets a job as a university professor where he begins teaching literature and also becomes involved with a group of wealthy and privileged elites, including Malcolm Harding, one of his fellow professors, and his girlfriend, Kate Galvin. Although Joe tries to keep a low profile, Given his nature, he soon finds himself drawn to Kate and the elite London lifestyle. However, things kind of start going south when someone starts killing members of Joe's social circle and he becomes the prime suspect. At the same time, Joe also receives mysterious messages from a stalker who seems to know everything about his dark past. Soon, this stalker turns out to be Reese Montrose, a charismatic politician and member of high society who's secretly a homicidal maniac, much like Joe. As it goes, Reese tries to manipulate Joe into helping him eliminate anyone who opposes his political ambitions while making Joe appear guilty of the murders. However, Joe refuses to ally himself with Reese and tries to find a way to expose the real killer, all while struggling to avoid the police and protect Kate, for whom he begins to develop feelings. At the end of the season, we see Joe confronting Reese, and in a twist, it becomes clear that Joe had actually been struggling with his own sanity as he realizes that he had created an idealized version of Reese in his mind, and that, in reality, Reese was never directly involved in his crimes. In fact, the dude had no effing clue about what Joe was holding him accountable for. This reveals just how unstable Joe's mind has become over the years. In the final outcome, Joe once again flees from his past life, but this time he fully accepts who he is and just gives in to his dark side, suggesting that he may never be able to escape his murderous impulses, and so his only way to survive is to simply embrace the monster he truly is. What really turned Joe into a monster? So, Joe Goldberg grew up in a dysfunctional and abusive home. I'm talking about the kind of unstable environment that psychologists call complex trauma, or CPTSD. It happens when a child is constantly exposed to pain, betrayal, and emotional neglect, especially from the people who are supposed to protect them or care for them. For Joe, the trauma was brutal as he remembers his father burning cigarettes into his arm while interrogating him about his mother like it was some twisted punishment, and that kind of pain doesn't just fade. It leaves a mark that shapes everything that comes after. Moreover, Joe's mother, Sandy, was not exactly the ultimate villain in his story, as she was a victim of abuse too. She constantly suffered at the hands of Joe's father, and in her own way, tried to escape it. But instead of finding a healthy way out, she began cheating, disappearing on dates, and gradually became a neglectful mom to Joe. There were moments when Sandy would leave Joe alone in public just so she could go off on dates with strange men and do her own thing, and that kind of abandonment left deep emotional scars in the mind of the young boy. Joe still loved her though. He really wanted to be close to his mother and would do anything to protect her, especially from his father. But her love wasn't steady or consistent. It came and went, and more often, it just wasn't there. Then came a moment that may have shifted everything, as Sandy promised Joe that she would never let his father hurt them again and showed Joe a gun she kept hidden in the closet. She told him she planned to use it one day to kill his father, and at that moment, that single glimpse of intent may have planted a seed in Joe that would go on to grow into something much darker. This was far from being harmless, because what Joe experienced is something psychologists refer to as parental enmeshment, or more specifically in his case, maternal enmeshment. It happens when a mother becomes too emotionally entangled with her child by blurring boundaries and placing emotional burdens on them that they are far too young to handle. Often it comes from the parent's own unresolved trauma, and with Sandy, that was definitely part of the picture. In my opinion, the real damage came when she pulled Joe into her adult problems that no child should ever have to carry. The chaos at home, the instability, the fear, it shaped Joe's attachment to the people around him, causing him to develop a disorganized attachment style which can be described as a confusing mix of fear, anxiety, and a desperate need for love. Kids raised this way usually long for closeness, but are also terrified of it. It's actually the most unstable form of attachment, and is often tied to personality disorders and toxic, even violent relationship patterns later in life. So for Joe, the concept of love and pain became intertwined from the start. Somewhere deep inside, he learned that real intimacy had to be controlled, fixed, and dominated. And that control became his twisted version of protection. That's why, in the end, it wasn't Sandy who used the gun she kept hidden away, but it was Joe who pulled the trigger to protect her during yet another brutal beating from his father, thus ultimately killing him to rid themselves of his constant abuse. Even though Joe protected his mother out of love, she unfortunately didn't return that love in the way he needed. Not long after he killed his father for her, Sandy put him in a group home for troubled youth. Maybe she thought it was for the best for Joe to have a fresh start where he would get the kind of help he needed, but to Joe, it felt like pure abandonment. After everything he had done for her, she just walked away. And moreover, the place she left him wasn't any better than the home he had just escaped. If anything, it was just another version of the same nightmare. Joe was constantly bullied there, pushed around by the other kids, but it wasn't just the pain he went through that left a mark. What really got to him was seeing others suffer and feeling completely helpless to stop it. And that sense of powerlessness truly haunted him. His only bright spot in that hellhole was a nurse who showed him some form of kindness. Joe bonded with her quickly and felt safe around her until he found out she was in an abusive relationship. This reminded him of his parents all over again. But this time, the person in question wasn't his family, and so he didn't know how to intervene. One fine day, when the nurse suddenly stopped showing up, he feared the worst. And in true Joe fashion, he blamed himself for not being able to save her. That bond and its loss only deepened Joe's need to rescue or save people. It fed into what's known as white knight syndrome, where someone feels compelled to save others, even if it means losing themselves in the process. For Joe, it became more than just a need. In fact, it became his purpose. Joe's white knight complex didn't just shape his personality, it had deadly consequences. Over time, he developed a kind of hyper-empathy for women in pain, especially those who reminded him of his mother. On the surface, that might not sound like a bad thing, but when you mix it with his past, his early exposure to violence, his belief that killing could be a form of protection, it certainly becomes dangerous. For Joe, saving someone often meant crossing the line. If he thought a woman was in danger or hurting, he was not afraid to kill to rescue her. And in his mind, that violence wasn't evil, it was actually his love language, his duty. And if you add that to his abandonment issues from the deep wound left by his mother walking away, it only got more intense. Suddenly, love became something Joe couldn't just experience, as he had to own it, control it, keep it from slipping through his fingers, and anyone or anything that threatened that love had to go. So when you look at the whole picture, it was clear that Joe Goldberg didn't just wake up one day and become a monster. He was built that way, slowly and painfully, by a childhood full of unresolved trauma, loss, and twisted lessons about what love was supposed to look like. Was Joe groomed to become a pathological killer? So, as a teenager, Joe was taken in by a bookstore owner named Ivan Mooney. This seemingly kind man became his guardian and, for a while, seemed like a guiding figure in his life. On the surface, it looked like Joe had finally found stability, someone who cared enough to teach him and give him purpose. But, in reality, Mooney was just another source of pain disguised as mentorship. Mooney believed in the kind of tough love that crossed some serious lines. He convinced himself that his abuse was discipline, that he was shaping Joe into something better and stronger, but really, it was just another form of control. One of the most disturbing things he did was lock Joe in a glass cage in the basement of the bookstore, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, all to teach him a lesson. And yes, this was the same glass cage Joe trapped all his victims into as an adult. Anyways, Joe wouldn't be let out until Mooney believed he had learned whatever twisted moral or rule he was being pushed that day. To Mooney, this was structure, discipline, and a way to make sure Joe never became like his abusive father. He worked Joe to the bone, demanded perfection, and wrapped it all up in a warped idea of love and guidance. But what he was really doing was grooming Joe in a deeply damaging way by feeding him, teaching him, and at the same time punishing him under the illusion of care. And this kind of grooming is subtle but incredibly harmful because because it teaches a child that love must be earned, that affection comes with strings attached, and that pain is just a part of the deal. It basically builds a reward and punishment mindset that warps a person's ability to tell the difference between genuine care and manipulation. Of all the influences in Joe's life, Mr. Mooney might be the most important in shaping who he becomes. Because Mooney didn't just hurt Joe, he trained him to accept that hurt as love, and how sometimes you have to go to extreme measures for the benefit of the one you love. Joe might have truly believed that Mr. Mooney's harsh lessons were rooted in love, that the control, the punishment, even the cage were all meant to help him grow. But the truth is, it wasn't love. It was just plain and simple control. And that belief, that control equals care, followed Joe well into adulthood and manifested within his relationships. Joe's obsession and need to control weren't just habits to him, they felt like expressions of love. He didn't see the harm he did, because in his mind, that's what love had always looked like. And if you think about it, it wasn't really his fault, because Mooney had laid the groundwork early on, building a mental framework that equated dominance with devotion. In a similar fashion, that glass cage in the bookstore basement wasn't just a punishment, it became a symbol of how Joe would later treat the people he claimed to love. He would basically contain them, watch them, control them, and when they strayed from the story he had built in his head, he would punish them emotionally, psychologically, and sometimes even physically. Throughout the series, we see Joe repeat this same pattern over and over again. He didn't just trap people in locked rooms, but trapped them in his own ideas of who they should be. That kind of control runs deep, given that it started when he was just a kid, after being failed by every adult who was supposed to protect him. So when life threw him real challenges, he didn't know how to face them in healthy ways, but responded the only way he had ever been taught, which was through obsession, control, and violence. Be it Candace, Beck, Love, or Marianne, once Joe could not control their narrative, they all met the same fate at his hands, and that was an inevitable death. Joe's past trauma turned all his relationships into a psychotic blueprint of love. In the show, we see in flashbacks that Joe once dated a woman named Candace Stone, and for a while, it seemed like something real, but when he found out she was cheating on him, everything unraveled. Instead of processing that betrayal like a healthy adult, Joe snapped. Emotionally unstable and shaped by years of trauma, he didn't just take the betrayal personally, but saw it as a threat to his sense of control and worth. It wasn't just the cheating that broke him. It was the feeling of being fooled, lied to, made a fool of. That kind of humiliation was too much, especially for someone like Joe, who spent his whole life trying to create a version of love that feels safe and predictable. So he killed the man Candace had been with, not just out of jealousy, but as a way to erase the pain of being deceived. In his mind, taking control, even in a violent way, felt like the only way to fix what had been broken. This is where his psychological issues really start to blend together with obsessive love, revenge fantasies, and a quiet but dangerous sadism. Soon we realize Joe doesn't just want love. He wants control over it. And when it slips from his hands, his instinct is to destroy the thing or the person he blames for that loss. What makes it worse is that when Mooney found out what Joe had done, he didn't condemn it. Instead, he reinforced the behavior, telling Joe that sometimes people deserve what they get. That kind of approval, coming from someone Joe still saw as a moral authority, only further twisted his sense of right and wrong. It confirmed his belief that if you're hurt badly enough, and if you believe your reasons are justified, violence isn't just acceptable, it's righteous. Although Joe Goldberg's downward spiral didn't start with just one traumatic event, it was the result of years of layered, relentless abuse that completely warped his understanding of love and relationships. He never really learned how to love in a healthy way. What he learned was how to protect, trap, and punish people he cared about, not because he wanted to hurt them, but because he believed, deep down, that betrayal was inevitable. In Joe's world, control was mistaken for love, punishment was framed as discipline, and abandonment was something to be expected. But these beliefs didn't make him emotionally distant, they made him possessive. For Joe, loving someone wasn't about connection, it was about ownership. This twisted perspective became painfully clear in his relationship with Beck, because from the moment he met her, something snapped in him. He fixated on her instantly, and that interest quickly spiraled into obsession. Rather than getting to know her the normal way way, Joe turned to her social media, piecing together the details of her life like a puzzle. And when that wasn't enough, he started following her very literally by watching her in public, spying through her windows, and tracking her every move. To Joe, this did not feel like stalking. It felt like love. But to everyone else, it was something far more dangerous. As time went by, he thought passively controlling Beck's life by taking Benji and Peach from her life was his way of protecting her from the people who constantly hurt her one way or the other. Joe always needed to be in control of the narrative, so he could indirectly dominate the one he claimed to love however he wished. Throughout the show, we get a front row seat to Joe's inner world because his thoughts are narrated in real time. And what becomes clear is that he doesn't view stalking as something wrong or invasive because in his mind, it was a gesture of love. This goes beyond obsession, and what Joe exhibits is something known as erotomania, which is a psychological disorder where someone truly believes another person is in love with them or would be if only a few obstacles were out of the way. Joe basically viewed himself as the hero of a romantic novel, as every glance, every word, every coincidence becomes part of some epic love story he has been crafting in his head. But in reality, he was not falling in love with the real person in front of him. He was falling in love with the fantasy version of that person he had created in his head, the one who fits perfectly into his world. So when Joe does things like stalk Beck, dig through her phone, or follow her without her knowing, he convinces himself that he is doing it for her. He twisted these deeply unethical actions into something noble, something justified, because in his eyes, it was all in the service of the love story he believed they were living. What makes it even more disturbing is how calculated his approach was. Joe doesn't manipulate with threats or loud aggression, but he does it quietly. He studied Beck through her social media and her routines, gathering every detail he could so he could become the perfect guy. The truth is, if you know everything about someone, it's easy to morph into the person they are most likely to fall for, and Joe uses that to his full advantage. His manipulation is subtle but powerful. He mirrors Beck's values and interests, especially her love of literature, making her feel deeply understood and emotionally connected. If someone shares your passions, especially the niche ones, it's hard not to feel that instant bond, and Joe knows that. Then, when she starts to question him or feels uneasy, he basically gaslights her. Joe simply denies, deflects, and twists her reality until she feels confused or even guilty for suspecting anything. What Joe has been doing is dark psychological seduction. He's not just playing the part of the perfect boyfriend, but exploiting emotional wounds, using vulnerability and trust to install himself as Beck's savior. It's basic manipulation dressed up as romance, and that's what makes it so terrifying. And it does not stop with Beck. After she finds out about his reality, Joe kills her and escapes to LA in order to leave his old life behind. But the cycle repeats itself once again with love, even though she was just as psychotic as him. This time, Joe wasn't happy to find himself the soulmate he had longed for, but was disgusted by her darkness and his lack of control in their narrative, which moved him to become obsessed with Marianne, who allowed Joe to become her knight in shining armor. Still, the cycle went on as Joe killed love to get away from her obsessiveness and moved to London, where he once again found his idea of love in Kate. Now, there's honestly a boatload of things to discuss when it comes to Joe's psychopathy in You, but in this video, I really wanted to narrow down on what drove him to become such a psychotic monster. The cycle of abuse Joe suffered in his childhood was continued by him in his own twisted way through all his relationships. Through the end of season 4, we also see how Joe is suffering from split personality disorder, which has been foreshadowed in the series for quite a while, but that's definitely a video for another day. With that being said, what do you think was the main reason behind Joe's descent in becoming a monster? Let us know your thoughts and theories in the comment box below. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks, everyone.